Hello! This is Timothy Vilgiate, and I'll be playing the role of John in this next episode of Rivers of the Mind. But before we start, because this show is about someone who gets superpowers on LSD, I wanted to include a disclaimer. Just to be clear, this show is not meant to promote the illicit use of LSD or really the abuse of any substance. LSD will not make you better at interacting with the police, and in fact, anecdotal evidence suggests that it may do the exact opposite. At the same time, for the interests of harm reduction, I'd like to mention that every LSD trip will eventually end. That is to say, this show is not a typical LSD trip. Don't worry, it will end. And even though most psychedelics are classified as more dangerous than cocaine, methamphetamine, or PCP, the effects of the drug are temporary and do not lead to permanent insanity, so don't freak out. Events portrayed in this series are strictly fictional, and any resemblance to actual events is coincidental. With all that said, here is the second episode of Rivers of the Mind, entitled The Dragon from Beyond. Stumbling down the road through rural Texas, the starlight dripped down through my pores, and a cool and serene ecstasy floated down the wind. Looming colors hung across the night sky, along an infinite distance, as the ground undulated ceaselessly through a forever's worth of hills and tiny houses, like waves of endless sound. I'd grown used to the thoughts. They swirled like a cloud all around me, Doppler-affected mumblings shining from the drivers that zoomed along the highway and pouring out like fire from hearths inside of the houses I passed by. This power that now laid inside my mind at once overwhelmed and enraptured me. It had to be more than just acid. Enough people had taken acid, I thought, that by now someone would have gotten superpowers if it was possible. I thought back to the place where I'd taken it. The man had traded 7 tabs of acid to me for the healing crystals, and he half joked and half suggested that the government worked on dismantling alien spaceships there. And so I had to return. I had to return to find the truth for myself. To crawl my way back to the womb where I'd been reborn. Blackberry Creek. I felt strangely aware of what I could do. Even stranger, I was less aware of what I was feeling. Trying to define my thoughts, the direction of them was impossible. I was lost in every second that passed, drinking up their sweet elixir and hoping that they didn't eat me alive. Wandering through the field of my consciousness and hoping that I didn't step on a landmine. Momentary thoughts and impulses were only that, warring by me for an instant in 1,000 scattered voices and leaving me there. I didn't bother grabbing onto them. They moved too fast. Instead, my mind was split up into 1,000 pieces, all working at once like a million gears and springs and switches. It left me aware but rudderless. I was a boat in the current of this unconscious energy. Every thought lost in that great river of the mind meant little, and its essence was ephemeral. In spite of that sense of momentum, the burden of choice still pressed in on me. Which of those thousands of meanderings and diversions I chose to pursue on this dramatic course mattered, and more than ever, I felt that each action, each step, each breath that I took was starkly intentional. The exercise of titanic willpower. And what terrified me more than anything was the thought of doing something wrong. It terrified me so much that I dreaded doing anything at all. I really felt like I could kill a man if I wanted to. If he looked at me for a few seconds, I could suck his mind from his body and swallow him whole in a torrential avalanche of all of his memories and doubts, withering him down to the bone. But at the same time, I felt like I could kill myself just as easily. Lean back into the chaos that surrounded me, and I'd float away, never to return. Stop myself from breathing, and I'd fade away. I'd step into traffic. I'd be torn to bits like fog on a windshield. I could light myself on fire with the force of my own energy. The slightest lapse of concentration, the slightest desire to fight the river, or to cling to something in particular, it would devour me. I imagined that even though I felt like I could walk across dimensions, all at once, with the slightest impulse, peel my mind and body apart and drift between worlds and times and planes of existence, I felt strangely minuscule, and trapped, confined, underneath a snow globe sky with no companion but the dead-eyed Texas moon. All became felt. All became known. All became sensible and irrational and terrible and perfect. I felt a reason in the geometry of my surroundings, a unity with it, which transcended language and became a perpetual dialectic silence. I felt the deadness of the pavement, the life of the grass, the purgatory of the shoots of clover springing up from the cracks in the gravel. I could start fires with my mind, and I could stop them just as easily. My every word and step could at once be a sword and a shield, cracking the earth apart and putting it back together. But even then, I was completely powerless. A true drifter. Or else it was just strong acid. Very, 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 very strong acid. I shouldn't have accepted it. Real LSD. It's super hard to find. Maybe it was PCP. I met a guy on PCP once, and he thought he could read minds. A few months later, I saw him on the news. He was naked, and he was trying to fight a 6-year-old girl dressed as a dragon. Well, outside of the park where I camped, there's a police car blocking the road. Terrified of the police, I tried to listen in to their thoughts. Damn, this is some weird ass shit, one of them thought, imagining an explosion of energy in the sky. Last night, something terrible had happened, and that was all he knew. All he remembered. He hadn't been paying attention during the briefing, since he was more concerned with his son. He'd caught the boy smoking the devil's lettuce the other night. All he remembered was drowned out by his preoccupation. He was worried about what happened to him happening to his son. I looked into the mind of his partner next. She was looking down at her phone. She was a middle-aged woman who had married young and joined the Navy. Neither of those decisions had been a good choice, especially in light of her history of migraine. With her phone in her hands and her headphones in her ears, she was looking at German bondage porn, wondering what her partner would think if she found out she was into that, let alone her boring vanilla-ass husband. I looked through her memories, tuning out the sounds of muffled and painful German orgasms which played in the background. The Air Force was managing the site. She didn't know why, but she heard something about testing a rocket and lots of radiation. She wasn't allowed to know anything else, but the commanding officer had... I bumped into the police car, not having watched where I was going, as I used my magic LSD powers to read the police officer's minds. I fell over and whimpered at the all too real pain in my goddamn shin. The male officer stepped out of the car. His name was Philip. He thought that I smelled awful and assumed that I was expecting to camp out in the field. All at once, he began to associate me with his son. I felt ashamed as he quickly jumped to worrying that his poor boy would end up like me. The woman, whose name was Grace, jumped out of the car with pleasure, hoping that she'd get to handcuff me. I jumped to my feet, disturbed by her fantasizing. "You okay there, buddy?" asked Philip. Yeah, I was distracted. Sorry. Distracted by what? Wondered Philip. Grace prepared to search me mentally. I couldn't stop looking over at her, deeply uncomfortable with her sexual fantasies. "Please don't do that to me," I thought towards her. She looked back.
"What was that?"
Philip peeked over his shoulder, jumping. "What? Did you say something?"
"He just said something,"
she said. I raised my eyebrows. "What?" Before thinking at her, as an aside, "I am inside of your thoughts, Grace. Don't say anything." Terrified her, her eyes darted back and forth. A flurry of possibilities flashed through her mind before she decided that she was hearing things because she was about to have a migraine. I repeated her name and projected an image in her head of an especially gross fish. She hated fish. For some reason, she always pictured them right before a migraine. Wincing, she raised her hand up to her face and breathed deeply. Philip shook his head. "Why are you out here this late?" he asked, intermittently glancing with concern at his partner. He knew her marriage was having problems. Sometimes he wanted to make them worse. Maybe try some of the stuff he caught her looking at on her. Ashamed, he mentally slapped himself in the face. Someone had done the exact same thing to him just a few years ago. I needed somewhere to sleep. I camped here last night. What's wrong? Philip gulped and glanced back at Grace as he tried to remember the right lie. Grace gritted her teeth. Of course Philip forgot.
Water main break. They need to repair the pipe.
Can I?
We aren't supposed to let anyone back here.
Grace snapped, rubbing her temple. Her head didn't hurt, but she knew it was coming. Any second now. I moved a little closer to the officer, trying to look him in the eyes. I think I left my canteen last night. Can I reached into his mind and I pulled forward a sermon he barely remembered from 3 or 4 years ago when he still went to church. Can I go look for it? Guilty, he looked back at Grace, who resented Philip for being so soft, even if it made her think quite a bit about tying him up and, oh, God, never mind. I backed away from her thoughts. I can walk with him, Philip offered. Grace sighed, too prepared for the impending migraine to do anything to stop him.
Okay.
She begrudged, turning back to her phone. Philip patted me on the shoulder, just like he did to his son, and walked with me towards the field. What's your name, buddy? It's John Silvers? He nodded, carefully trying to remember his sensitivity training before he asked any questions that might offend me. Most of his most terrifying nightmares either involved violating what he learned in sensitivity training or a camel, which he considered to be a horrible, disgusting, rude creature and coincidentally fit for his self-image. We started trudging up a hill. Are you from around here? I'm from California. Oh, really? What part? The Sacramento area? He looked around once we made it up the hill. I scanned the surroundings and pretended to look for my water bottle, but I was really searching for any wandering mind that might explain to me what had happened. I was staying further back there. I lied, able to trace from his mind and the mind of the partner that the location of the military base was where I was pointing. Well, how about you? Where are you from? I asked. Mentally, I planned the thought that he might bring up his son. He rejected it, quietly but firmly. Well, I'm from here. I'm a 5th-generation Texan. So you just passing through, son, or what? I'm just passing through. I hunt crystals. Crystals, huh? I hunt blue topaz here in Texas. Yep, crystals. Faintly, the officer could remember in college when he'd gone to a rave and he'd taken way too much ecstasy, and he found a patch of rose quartz. It was a great sample, and, well, I was impressed. Well, anyway, he was studying art history back then, and his parents didn't like that. On the come down from the ecstasy, he got so depressed that he changed his major to criminal justice. He envied me, something that made me truly uncomfortable. But I released the feeling of discomfort as it came into my head, and tried to avoid looking too deeply into his thoughts. I already felt like I knew him better than his ex-wife, who'd never known about the ecstasy. You can find some nice crystals around here, he said, referencing the rose quartz. Definitely, I said, mumbling under my breath. I found a lot of nice crystals around here. I still hadn't found anyone else's thoughts, but I read in the contours of his anxiety that we were getting closer. And beyond him, there was certainly a tension in the air. I tried to look deeper into it, to understand it. No, that's not what it was. It was not a tension, but a death. A spiritual void. A sorrow. A death that spilled from the trees in a sap, running down the mountains. I stepped into it and looked down at my shoe. It dripped in thick globs from my boots. You step in something? Death. I mean, yes. It's okay. You know, son, they got a shelter about 3 miles east of here. I looked at him. It wasn't a very good shelter, he didn't think. Well, I imagined if I prodded him, he'd admit it, and so I did. What's it like? Oh, it's not too bad, he lied, before clarifying his answer to imbue it with a sense of euphemistic truth. I mean, it's not too bad for a little town out in the hill country. But, I guess I'd understand if you were more keen on staying in the great outdoors. Yeah, I used to stay in shelters, actually, but, it really made me feel guilty. How come? I'm not... My feet sunk into a glob of thick blue slime. I looked back over to the mountain, and an officer, before I realized he couldn't see it. Besides, that was the last of his worries. Collapsed into the ground up ahead was a towering, slaughtered dragon. A beast from another dimension that had been torn up upon impact. I scratched my head in disbelief. What is it? He asked, feeling a strange, foreboding sense in his stomach from my emotions. He couldn't see. I was overcome by sadness for the poor creature. Only a shred of its life force remained as it atrophied there. It was strong, but unable to survive away from its native dimension. I tried to pull myself into the dragon's mind. It was only barely hanging on. I think I see it, I said, lying to the officer so that I could move closer to Titanic Beast. In these bushes, here is where it is. Here. I came close enough that my consciousness touched the dragon. Though its language was not one that I could fathom, I knew in bits and pieces that it was a mighty beast in the place where it came from, and this was not its home. I pictured a stranger world where the dragons all swam through vibrant cities built for an alien physics. It opened its eyes and looked down at me. Terrified, I fell to my knees and extended my hand to pretend to reach for a water bottle. Immediately, our consciousnesses merged. The senses I felt within the dragon were not Earth senses, and I knew at once that what it felt being stranded here was cruel and unusual. Its body was overcome by searing pain in a terrifying new universe, one where it could not seem to die like a good dragon should. Its consciousness was a wonderland in full bloom, but only a ghost town in its current state. Who was it? What had happened to it? I looked familiar to it, certainly. The beast had seen me before. Maybe when it crossed over. Sorrowfully, I drew it into me. I didn't know why. I only knew that I had to. The beast's soul, long and winding, stretched around us like a snake. The officer looked at me with horror as I started shaking. Though he couldn't see the dragon, he could see the bright blue lights. Blue lights streaming from the forest and settling in front of me like fairies. I concentrated, shrinking the light until it was as small as the head of a pin and infinitely bright. I knew I could not bear to bring it inside of my skull, or it could explode. That was when I remembered it. The crack in the universe. I remembered it, and all at once it clicked. The beast had been sucked into our world from the other side. And my mind had been near the edge, but had resisted the pull. Why, I did not know. But somehow it had. Oh, when I thought about it, I could remember that vaguely there had been something holding me back. And when I tried to picture it again, I realized there had been some sort of person. Someone I would never know. In the end, the two of us, the dragon and I, had shared a common fate here. Both of us were victims of the same disaster. Both of us homeless and far away from where we belonged. Strangers suddenly in our own bodies. I focused on the place where he'd come from. It was sealed up. I found it in my mind's eye, and the police officer watched as the sky lit up and my soul, radiantly visible, carried the dragon upwards. We were in a dance, almost, as we moved, as we flew, as we rose. The dragon's wary heart filled with joy. Its body convulsed as it prepared for death. Climbing and climbing into the stratosphere, we passed a city in the clouds, which was punctuated with intricate invisible machinery and strange forms of life, until we were there. The hole in the edge of the universe. Raw from the previous night, but sealed shut, seemingly. I concentrated on it. It flickered with light and sucked the dragon back in. My soul flooded back into my body with a shockwave of bright violet light. Far ahead, in the distance, I could see a man in a cloak, holding a fishing pole. He was looking at me. I couldn't see into him. It was only a shadow. He nodded with approval. And suddenly, I forget now. Where what? Blackberry Creek is... I meant Blackberry. The police officer was trembling behind me, able to see briefly the dragon just as it had died, and the violent light just spreading across the forest. All at once my memories flooded back to me. I stared at the officer. I knew I could plant thoughts in his mind, but I wasn't sure how much I could pull off. I wasn't sure if I could erase his memory. Thinking quickly, I rushed back towards the forest, and I knelt down, pretending that I was looking for a water bottle. I mimed one, and forced with all my mind the image of a small canteen. What just happened? Are you okay, man? I asked. He shook, wondering if his senses deceived him. Laughing, I brushed it off and tried to gaslight him. Dude, some trippy shit happens in the forest sometimes. The officer looked back and forth, coming to grips with the fact that he had imagined it all. Perhaps an ecstasy flashback. The illusion was holding. I looked into his mind and found the memory somewhere drifting through a synapse. I didn't know quite the mechanism, but I pulled it, and the memory became remembered as a dream. A chemical shift to which I was distinctly attuned. Other chemicals in his mind began swirling about. His pupils dilated, and he released a cascade of serotonin. A familiar feeling. It felt like MDMA, but stronger. Much, much stronger. Well, thank you folks so much for tuning in. My name is Timothy Vilgiate. I play the part of Philip and John in this episode of Rivers of the Mind. Michelle Pearl was in charge of playing Grace. That was the female police officer. And then Jareth was the voice that came from the field, the distant voice from the field. Music in this episode, the rave music specifically, was provided by Michette or Miché. Their track Elevator, which was taken with a Creative Commons attribution license from the Free Music Archive. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please tune in next week for our episode entitled Lords of the Field. I hope you all have a great night. Stay safe. Remember to tip your servers and, as always, stay Gucci.